Good afternoon, good evening to all of you, wherever you are. This is the webinar series on theories on regulation and governance. My name is David Levi-Faur, and today we are hosting a dear colleague, Arie Freiberg, from Emeritus Professor from Monash, Australian citizen, was born in Israel, but then moved at the age of 6 to Australia. So we lost it, but we gained a lot of insight on regulations that I'm not sure that we would have if Ari would stay in Israel, because Australia is the country of regulation. It's not only the country where it was established by criminals, but also the country where regulation took such a wonderful research role and is still innovative in the study of regulation, but also in how regulation is being implemented, designed in practice. And as it happened, one of the founders of the regulation and governance literature, one of the leading social scientists of the world today, John Braithwaite, is with us. It was not planned, but he came and is in Liberia. And I will ask him to say a few words on his colleague from Monash, Melbourne. And yes, John, please.
Well, okay, well, I'm not prepared for this. And I also need to apologize to those who didn't hear me earlier. I am in Liberia and I do have to race off to an interview before Ari gets too deep into his presentation. But I really wanted to come along to this because Ari is such a great inspiration to us in Australia, and I know internationally as well. And I haven't seen the most recent volume, but his first version of this particular book was, tour de force, really. So let's hope you can up that accomplishment in your latest version. One respect in which I'd be critical of it is that it doesn't. Oh God, there's someone knocking on my door. But I'll just get rid of this person.
Yeah, so it's critical. Let me say that the book is big. It's about 500 or more words. Wow, it's big. And it's as big, but it's not as big as the list of publications that Ari has. He's going towards the 200. So, and this moves all the way from, he's criminologist, right? He's lawyer, criminologist, he's everywhere, social science. But John, you wanted to say something, so please.
Yeah, I was going to say that one of Ari's greatest strengths, which is not evident, at least was not. I don't think it is evident in this book. I don't have the title in front of me, but Ari's famous for great titles. The first one that came to my attention was one he did with. Now I've forgotten the name of his co-author at the moment, but it was about Indigenous justice in Australia, and it was Gumtree Justice. That simple beauty of a title that's evocative, and it really grabbed my imagination as how to do titles. And he's also, as many of you know, a quirky kind of guy with a sharp, clever sense of humor, as well as being a clever in the way he does his scholarly work and the way he puts it together. He had, it was one of his more boring articles, I would have to say, in the sense that it was a useful article. It was a descriptive article about Australian criminological comparativism. It was asking the question, he's also, probably more than anything else, a scholar of criminal sentencing. And this book was about when Australian criminal courts sentence someone to life imprisonment, what actually happens to them? So it was reporting these tables that had, well, if you're sentenced in Queensland, on average, you'll actually only spend, 11.7 years in prison after you get a bit of time off for good behaviour, etc. Whereas in New South Wales, 14.2 years, in Northern Territory, 16.1, etc. So that was this contribution to the literature, useful, but not intellectually stunning. But the title was its greatest asset, and the title was The Meaning of Life, which drew a great number of people to want to read and say, what is Arie writing about now? But he does write about a diversity of things, as you can see in the difference between this book that's before us today and those two publications. He's a creative guy, a great leader of our intellectual communities in regulation and in criminology in Australia. He's been dean of that law school where he sits, also head of a department at the University of Melbourne. He's done it all, and I would say done it all very well.
So thank you so much, John. This is a wow. Was not meant to be, but it's welcome addition. Arie, shall we go directly to the presentation? I will upload the presentation, the title of the presentation. Here we are.
Thank you.
Do you all see it? Yeah, you should. So, Arie, the floor is yours.
Good, thank you. And David will be managing the slides because I couldn't upload them, but it couldn't be a greater honor to be on the screen between David and John Braithwaite talking about not on the shoulders of giants, but sitting next to them. That's pretty good. I'll settle for that. And thanks, John, for your very kind words. In fact, John followed me after my first job in Canberra at the Australian Institute of Criminology. I think he may have had the room next to me where I was in the early 70s. But, as you know, John had a crummy career after me and barely known ever since in those areas. But anyway, lovely to see you, John, and thanks for your kind words. So this book, the title of which you can see, and as you can see behind me, it's a fairly large text. If you go to the next one, David, thanks. It's in fact the third to the next slide. If you have a look at that, unfortunately, I couldn't find a good image. In fact, is the third edition. The first one that John mentioned was done in 2010, and that followed many years of teaching from the 1990s at Melbourne University and then at Monash on regulation. They were the early days when we were developing the field, and John was pioneering in that area. In those days, the book on shame was a major feature. And as you could see, if you just go back a fraction, just see there's about 7 years between them, and over the years, like myself, the book has grown in size. Maybe that's a sign of aging, but it is, I have to say, something like 700 or 800 pages. But it's difficult to say that a book of that size is, can I say, a mile wide and an inch deep, covering the field of regulation. It's grown so dramatically and so powerfully over the years, the discipline, the scholarship, the amount of material. So I have a feeling that, I have to apologize that it's so superficial when it covers so many areas, but it does attempt to cover a great field. As you see in the next slide.
Yeah. Before I move to the next slide, I would just want to say that the book is available online, so you can get it from the Federation Press in Australia according to chapter, and you can download it. this way as well. So this is my part, and now back to you,
Thank
Arie.
you. Okay, so it's got now 22 chapters. As I said, it's grown. And if you look at the various areas, the preliminary material is what everyone knows. I have to say, I mean, the book is aimed at those who don't have a great understanding of regulation. And I'll talk about the audience in a minute. But, you know, you have to start with what the hell is it and why does it matter? And I think everyone has to cover that. It then goes on to the history, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then the questions of why, who, how, when, and the like. So it really is I'd say, who done it, why done it, how to do it, and the like. So those are the early chapters, and it then moves on to some very basic issues of good regulation, the burdens, and then the core of it, which I will discuss in some detail, what was the first version of this back 15 years ago on the tools of regulation, with great a debt to Professor Hood, who died recently, and that he was one of the great pioneers there. If we go to the next one, David, thanks. The areas of compliance and enforcement, of course, and they take up enormous volumes of other books. Van Rooij and various others have been writing, and of course, the questions of enforcement are central to what regulators need to do. Chapter 19 on regulatory strategy, of course, talks about the major issues. We're talking about responsive regulation. John, you may have had a passing acquaintance with that. Really responsive regulation, the current flavor of the decade, risk-based regulation, smart regulation, Malcolm Sparrow's work. I think, you know, students who are studying this have to have some of that background. And then it moves on to what I think is a very overlooked topic of evaluation. Phyllis, you know, that idea of the policy cycle, whether there is such a thing, but going around to evaluation, which is often forgotten, and some major issues on the relationship that's in the literature on the tension, if there is one, between innovation and regulation. And the last chapter really makes the argument that we are still an emerging discipline. I remember when David and John first launched regulation and governance, I mean, they were really there pioneering the field, and the journal, which has gone from strength to strength, indicates the importance of the development of the discipline, which is still a bit of a struggle, which is explained in that last paragraph. And in fact, the book ends with, you know, this is what the modern regulator needs to know all of this to become, well, you know, not a master of the discipline, but what Malcolm Sparrow would call the regulatory craft. I think that's what the book is about. So that's the overview. And I say that, and the bibliography runs to over 70 pages, which again barely scratches the surface. About as long as John Braithwaite's bibliography, just on one topic, and David Levi-Faur's work in the last year. Anyway, next slide.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, so 22 chapters in five sections. And actually the sections, this is something that I ask you to do, because in the book itself, it's not divided this way. But now you have, all of you have kind of an idea what is there. I'm simply giving you an opportunity to capture the richness of the subjects of the book. So thank you, Arie, and now we can go forward.
Okay, next slide. Thank you. So who's the audience for this? You know, we all write books hoping to speak to someone. You have an imaginary reader in your mind when you're writing this. Well, I've been teaching this for 25, 30 years, like many of you. And really, it's an introductory text. And what I've found in teaching, I've done quite a bit of consulting, a lot of seminars and the like. And I'm always surprised how little people know about regulation when they come in, because of the backgrounds that they have. They come in as lawyers, economists, political scientists, social workers, police. And in many of the agencies that I will speak at or to, there's a large turnover of staff, so there's always an audience. And I know that the the ANZ School of Government in the community of practice now has 7,000 people who are involved in that, and that's a huge audience in the sense of that the regulatory community is large, and I think people are always keen to know, and many of the courses now are important. But going about the basics, I think, is fundamental. I mean, we can go deep, and I think a lot of the literature now is, I'm not going to say inaccessible. It's developing the field, but if we go back to the introduction, the basics, that's what it's about. So, as I say, the well of ignorance about regulation is very deep, and people still mistake regulations for regulation, and that's the first thing I talk about. Thanks, David. Next one.
Yeah. But when you say regulation, what do you mean? Can you define it, or you prefer not to?
No. I'm very happy to talk about it. So if you go to that next one, look, my basic argument here that that it's not about rules and it's not about standards. It's about a mechanism to achieve public policy objectives through a variety of means, which it means it's very challenging for a lot of people, especially lawyers who keep thinking about rules. And I think both you and John have taken that expensive view. So it really, I taught a subject for many years called Governing by the Rules. And the first thing I did was say, it's not all about rules, which was a great disappointment to many of the public servants who are in there. I say you can start with rules, but remember John wrote a wonderful article about the difficulties of interpreting rules. And so it's really basically saying, taking the Celtic and Julia Black arguments, that it's about how to achieve public value. And you've got this whole array of mechanisms that you can do that. And it broadens out then, of course, into the modern literature on governance and government. It talks about the politics of regulation, which I think is very important. I certainly make the point that's echoed by many that it's not an atheoretical, apolitical discipline. It is embedded in the political environment. We have to understand that. And I think that also the material that's important recently on legitimacy and how we gain that is important. So as you can see there, it's about a broader approach as you know, you've written, and everybody, I think the whole idea of regulatory space, which I'll come back to, is about that. But really, when I'm teaching this and when I'm going to talk to public servants, I say, what is it that you want to do? And here is some of the ways that you go about it. And regulation is just simply an understanding of that. It takes a while for people to accept that because all people think about is rules. Regulation is restrictive, it's confining, it's about rules. And I spend a lot of time in the book talking about the limitations of that. So that's the first chapter. If you go on to the next slide, David.
Yeah, I want to go. Before I go to the next slide, I would like to ask you, what would be interesting for me or new for me or for John or anyone in this audience from the first chapter?
Yeah.
Something that you want to emphasize.
That it's about achieving public policy objectives. That's what it's about. It's not about the rules. It's not about the minutiae. It's about how do you go about doing what you want to do as a government, as a regulator, and here's what you need to understand to do that. So it's really trying to force people away from a very narrow concept. You can see the third heading there is a broader approach.
Okay.
It relates to government. It relates to intentionality. All of those, direct, indirect, all of that. That's what it's about. It's just trying to smash the paradigm that people come with, that we're used to, but they've got to do it. So this is where I sort of parted way with David and some of the modern theorists. I'm sorry, David, but I know, David, upon my desk, I've got, your Regulatory Capitalism, that book there, and all the writings that are modern. But I take a longer historical view, and I had the advantage of having lots of time when I became an emeritus, and I thought I want to go back to the beginnings of the Australian state, as you said, we were a colonial settlement there back in the late 18th century, and I went back to England in the Industrial Revolution, 1830s onwards, and what I saw there, and again, John, you're on my screen, so I can address you. I mean, there was some of your language in one of your articles or books about the night watchman state, and I thought, this sort of idea of the state sitting back. So I went back and I read every statute and every regulation I could find from the beginning of settlement in Australia back in the early 1800s, and looked at England, and I argued that the regulatory state, as we know it, the modern one, emerged in the 19th century. And if you look at in great detail, there were hundreds, and this is England, and I looked at Victoria and New South Wales when they were colonies, administrative bodies with the degree of autonomy of governments. They had set standards, they enforced them. They had all the criteria of modern regulatory bodies. There were hundreds of these bodies, not exactly the same, but they had subject matter expertise, they had delegated powers, they did all of these things. In fact, recently in Berlin at the conference, I think it's Eva Heims, I ran across her and congratulated her, and I think it's Pierre Six, who's got his name that now gets him in front of every bibliography by having his name as Six, had made the same arguments and looked at the colonial office in England. And so I've taken issue, I've taken a huge amount of time there to say the idea that regulation starts in the US in the first federal agency is just wrong. It's just rubbish. Go back to the 1789, the foundation of the US, and you go back beyond that to the colonies. All of those either brought English law, English procedures, English institutions. So I say, look at it historically. Of course, it's changed, it's transformed, but I think the modern regulatory state is not as modern as I think. If you look at the next slide,
just to say that chapter 2 is called the regulation in Australia, and of course I get it that regulation didn't start at the late 19th century or in the US, but something happened in the realm of democracy, the way, the structure, the architecture of the administrative state in the late 19th century in the United States, which had the effect all over the world in maybe a century later with the creation of regulatory agencies all over the world. But so I don't see, and I'd like you to answer. I don't see this as antithesis to what we know, and I would like to ask you what this additional information, very important one, how does it change the way we see regulation? Does it change the way we see the politics of regulation, the shortcomings of regulations, etc.?
Look, I think my argument, David, is that there's a continuity, and that a lot of the writings that you've edited and the modern scholars that are coming along say, oh, the modern regulatory state, if we look at either the late 19th century US or the 60s and 70s onwards, where we have these major changes, that this is where the story starts. And I want to say the story, like all stories, have a very long history. And of course it's transformed. And of course the nature of economies change and the political structures change and different jurisdictions change. And some of them are fundamental, but I think there's an historical continuity. And even the notion of the risk society and what regulation and risk, if you go to the next slide, please, David.
Just another mention here is the work of Michael Moran on the history of the British regulatory state. It's fascinating as well.
Yeah.
So next chapter, let me this
Well,
one.
just one more slide on that. I mean, what I did, I had the advantage of going through. I mean, it took weeks and weeks and weeks without a research assistant, but I went through the statute book, and Victoria had the advantage of in the late 1800s, there was a consolidation of the big mess that the statute books were in. So somebody sat down and brought them all together into a consolidation. And there was one in 1928 which really brought together a century and cleaned up the mess. But if you have a look at what the world looked like in Victoria in 1928 in the statute book, and I counted 107 acts, and I'm not going to read them out to you, but it's alphabetical. I put them in alphabetical order. But you can see many of those were about managing risk, but that we didn't use that language. And again, I understand the transformations in our theory and understanding, but many of them were called, an act to regulate gunpowder, an act to regulate. I mean, these concepts were known, but if you look at this is not the night watchman state in the sense that all of these areas were very, very closely regulated. And you look at all the professions growing and occupations and the licenses and everything else, that there was a hell of a lot of it around. And there were a lot of regulatory bodies around in different forms. John, you wanted to take issue with me.
Just unmute yourself, John.
I just decided I should write a note in the chat on that conversation you were having. I always think that Oliver McDonough's book on the 19th century British state, I don't know if any of you have ever read it. It's quite an old book. He's a historian, an Irish historian, and why I think it's so important on that exchange between David and Arie is that you know how Charles Tilley got so famous by saying war made the state and the state made war. In a way, in that book that Oliver wrote, I think it's called the English 19th century administrative state or something like that, covering the kind of agencies that Arie was alluding to just before. He kind of makes an argument, if I can dress it up a bit, that regulation made the state and the state made regulation. So these problems came along, which tended often to be transitory problems. Like we've had transitory problems in this century. We had a lot of very effective regulation of people boarding aircraft because there was a wave of terrorists blowing up of aircraft in the 1970s, and scanning people as they walked onto planes was very effective. But getting people to take their shoes off, there's no reason to think that that's been effective. And an explosive small enough to fit in your shoe can also fit in your anus, for example. So, most countries don't bother with that, but particularly the Americans persist with an overregulation that requires us to take off their shoes, even though there has never been any incident of anyone successfully causing a terrorist incident by something they had concealed in the heel of their shoe. But then, like what I'm saying is, for most states that I visit, there's been a lot of movement in the opposite direction and shutting down a lot of those regulatory requirements that occurred after 2001 and after the 1970s, largely Palestinian terrorist incidents. But he describes the 19th century example, which comes from his Irish background, which is the steamship regulations, which is after the Irish famine, the transportation of all of those impoverished Irish farmers across to the United States, during which they were dying in droves. And so this was viewed as important to the English state and important to the US state. So this regulatory agency was established to administer the steamship regulations, which was not about the safety of the ships themselves, but the conditions in which those Irish workers were crammed into those steamships that sailed off across the Atlantic. So he argues that no one thinks that's an important kind of regulation today, but it was a form of regulation that was germinal in creating the English regulatory state. I think it's such an interesting book.
All
Thank
right,
you.
that's good. And,
Thank you, John.
Yeah, can we move on? Yeah, I'm conscious of the time as well. So the next chapters go on to why we do it, the whole questions of looking at the expansion of regulation, from steamships to the inexorable growth of regulatory provisions, the policy development, and a lot of work there, as you've been doing, David, and others, on trust in regulation and the conflicting pressures for cutting it down and increasing it. Now, the chapter 4, if you go to the next slide, this turned into a massive chapter, about 80 pages, about this simple question of who regulates, and it just kept growing and growing, and to include all the material. So Australia is in a wonderful situation, like Canada and the US, that we're a federation, so we have 3 levels of government to look at in terms of regulation and the distribution of powers. Beyond that, or between them, the question of what is a regulator. I mean, we go through the different names: agency, regulator, commissions, and all the rest of it. There's no one name that is a regulator. It's quite interesting. I wrote a piece, in fact, with my wife on what's in a name, because there is no one overarching name. The legendary issues of independence, agentification, overlap, conflict, a huge section on accountability, regulators' accountabilities, right through ombudsman, parliamentary accountability, audits, the whole works. The Archer and Moran on regulatory space, which I think still got a lot of power. The ideas of hybrid regulation, international, global. The current fashion in Australia, which we've imported from New Zealand, is on regulatory stewardship. I mean, who minds the whole system or bits of the system? It's now in Australian legislation. It's quite interesting how fashions come and go in regulation. I think we had behavioural economics was big a few years ago, and there's a chapter on that. But stewardship is now the flavour of the last few years, and the governments have adopted it. And I'm a member of the board of a regulatory agency for health practitioners, and stewardship is a big issue, and it's an important issue when you've got a regulatory system which has many different agencies and parties involved, and sort of who manages the system, and how do you bring it together. So as I say, fashions come and go in regulation as well. So that one turned into a big chapter. The next one, David. Chapter 5 is something that I've often used as a teaching tool, and that's using that sort of regulatory impact assessment or statement methodology. And I found that it provided a rigor for policymakers, for people who are tackling problems that in fact they never had and should use. I mean, here's a problem of, maybe it's bombs in the shoes, maybe it's a new chemical, maybe it's whatever the particular problem is. And I think policymakers and those working in those agencies don't really have a clue as to how to go about it. And I strongly believe that, that stepped approach that you have, what's the problem, who's involved, what are the options, how would you go about doing it, what are the cost benefit analysis and the like. I must say this book has almost nothing on cost-benefit analysis. I don't understand it. I know the Americans are obsessed by it, but it's just not an area that I know much about. But it was very practical, and I often use it and say, just go through this logical path to try to get to your outcome. And I think people have trouble with that. Chapter 6 simply sets out, what makes a good regulator, good principles. It's fairly prosaic. Chapter 7 was based on an article that I wrote with Jeroen van der Heijden and in fact, my wife, Monica Pfeffer, on the forever wars on red tape. And I don't know people coming from various parts of the world who are watching, but the eternal battle against the growth of regulation, deregulation, red tape goes on and on and on, although magically it just keeps growing. And so it examines what is red tape, how we understand it, what are the mechanisms that we can do to control it or reduce it, and what it means. But basically, it's a defense of the role of regulation in the state, which has come under the attack from the right wing very, very often. And this article, it's been cited quite a number of times because people who are involved in regulation need to have, if you like, a discourse to say what we're doing. And you can see what's happening in the US now with a great experiment on dismantling the deep state or the administrative state. And I think chapter 7, I'll probably be banned from entering America just on the basis of that chapter alone. So I won't head there. The next one, thanks. So chapters 8 to 15 are really where the first edition was all about, and it looks at the various tools. So the broad picture about law, about regulation as rules, soft law, just running people through the different kinds of regulatory tools, standards, codes, ethics, guidelines, all of these that shape behavior and are able to, in fact, again, bring about the public policy objective. So what I've tried to do in this edition is to talk a little bit about whether these things work or not and look at the literature, which previous editions were criticized for not saying, well, you got the tools, but how do they work? When do they work? And there's not a huge amount of literature on that. So if you go to the next one, this is I hope people can read this one because...
Yeah, I'll go for the next one, despite the fact that I have questions, but let's go.
Yeah, so I hope this is clear on the screen because it really is the centerpiece. Each one of those, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, is a chapter. And I think if ever I made a contribution again, I draw on the historical writings on tools of regulation and Michael Howlett and policy. All of those have been writing about that. But what I've tried to do here is make a set of artificial categorizations in economic, transactional, authorizational, informational, behavioral, structural. Karen Young was very influential in that. And recently, of course, RegTech and AI, how we use it and how we regulate it. But what's important, I don't think that the people that I talk to, I do consultancies and teach, don't understand the tools that they've got. They should go into a hardware shop and have a look at the whole range of tools instead of just coming in with a hammer and everything looks like a nail. So if you look, for example, at the economic, we know about price regulation, we know about taxes and charges, but very few people know about tax expenditures, which is the mechanisms government used to forego revenue. In Victoria, in Australia, we're having a big debate now about preferential taxation for superannuation to encourage saving, but it's costing billions. We have no capital gains tax on private housing. Again, that changes people's behavior. So the idea of providing incentives for people don't understand that their behaviors are shaped by these economic tools. The next one on transactional or agreements, again, hang on. Again, I make the argument here, if you look at the second one down on grants, if you look at what Trump is doing now, using the power of the federal government's granting powers and the money, the hundreds of millions and billions for universities and others, and withdrawing them or making them conditional, show the power of money, the power of that notionally transactional, not always equal, in being able to shape or get people to change their behavior. There are lots of others. Contracts, I mean, there's a lot of literature there on the modern regulatory state in terms of the steering and not rowing, all of those where we've become a contracting state, as we called it, where regulators become contract managers. And a lot of the conditions that were found in statutes are found in the contracts and regulation to bring about public policy objectives. The next one, I call that the oldie but a goodie. That's been around, I don't know, since God knows, hundreds of years on licenses, permits, registration, certificates, accreditation. That's boring in terms of regulatory theory, but I think incredibly important. As I often ask my students, how many of you have been to jail because you've broken the law? Nobody puts up their hand. And then how many people have got a license or a permit or anything? And everyone in the class has got a occupational license, a driving license, a fishing, a hunting, this sort of quiet, subtle control that we have. The use of information as a tool there, performance indicators, capability information, disclosure, all of those. Again, there's a bit of evaluation there in the literature which says that we like to use these, but we're not quite sure how effective they are in changing behavior. Behavioral insights, it's interesting. I don't know whether I'm just missing the literature or not reading it, but you couldn't escape it about 5 or 10 years ago, and now it's become part of the furniture. And I think regulators are using it, but it's not as exciting these days as when we're looking at RegTech and various others. The structural one I think is interesting about how you prevent people from doing it, whether they want to act in that way or not. And again, I think Karen Young and others pioneered in that field. So look, that's the central part. And I think, again, when I talk to people, and I hope in the book, people will get a granular understanding of what they are, what the literature is, when they might work, how they are. But I don't think people truly understand the range of weapons they have. It's criminal law, it's some civil law, maybe admin law, but not much else. So I think that's my contribution, I think. So if we go on to the next one. Just go back one. Thanks. So I remember listening to the previous seminar you ran, David, with Karen Young, and I just forgotten his name for the moment. We've all had books coming out at the same time. You cannot avoid writing about regulation these days without looking at AI, regulatory technologies, and the like. And of course, as soon as you write this, it's out of date. It's moving so quickly. But you cannot go to a conference, you cannot read anything these days without talking about AI and its challenges and its uses. So I had to get somebody else to help me with that particular chapter because it's not something that I know, but it is an incredibly important field and reasonably and pretty revolutionary, I think. Next one. Thanks, David. John, you might recognize this particular Egyptian hieroglyph here. So chapter 17 talks about compliance and non-compliance. And there's a section there which I think is incredibly important on why regulatory failures occur. And it focuses not only on regulatees or duty holders who do the wrong thing, but on regulators and governments who create crappy systems within which to operate or don't provide sufficient enforcement or resources. So if you like, it sheets the blame on both sides. I know, as I see on the screen, that my friend Simon Corden, doing his late life PhD on learning from regulatory failures and royal commissions and the like. He's up to 400 different examples of regulatory failures and responses. So there's a lot to learn about when things go wrong, and they do all the time. We've got a crisis now in childcare regulation. I mean, it's never boring in regulation, a big one now, but you can see this one, the diagram looks at all of the different tools. So there's an enormous chapter on many of those particular enforcement mechanisms that we have. Next one, David, thanks. So chapter 19 is, a bit of background for students who are interested in the whole history of the changes of regulation. I think I wrote in earlier drafts or books, John, we had two, there was the compliance oriented or that was coming out of your book with Peter Grabowski on, they were the two ideas that you have, but certainly you've become much more sophisticated in the nature of regulation. But it used to be, a fairly dichotomous understanding of what regulators were like. Anyway, that basically sets it out. The chapter on evaluation was a small part of the previous one, but I think this is often forgotten. I know Carey's written on this and others, but it basically says, do you know whether it works? Do you know what makes a difference? And the three criteria I put up there are, effectiveness, sufficiency, and adherence to basic principles of regulation, social justice, human rights, and the like. And the importance of understanding evaluation. And the next chapter goes on to look at innovation, how we deal with innovation traditionally. And of course, we looked at nanotechnology and AI, and everything else was new. Gas and electricity weren't new. Motor cars were new. So it takes a historical approach, but looks at sandboxes and all the other mechanisms, experimental regulation. So quite interesting literature on that. And finally, basically saying, we need to provide people coming in from whatever their background, and there are very few courses straight on regulation itself. I tried at Monash, I tried at Melbourne. I think they've got different versions at ANU and RegNet, but not many are. Maybe the LSE, I don't know. There aren't many other places, if you leave aside the economic regulatory teaching. Not a lot of interest, not the same as an MBA or Masters of Public Administration. Very hard to get those off the ground and get people there. So basically says we need to understand the regulatory craft, and this is what I think we got to do. And that's it, David. That's as I said, a mile wide and an inch deep.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let's say collect now comments from the audience, comments, and so on. I have one, but I will give others the opportunity to start. Anyone? Yes, John, please.
Well, I do agree with you, Arie, that the regulatory craft is a really good framing. And it's interesting, isn't it, that Malcolm Sparrow's book on the regulatory craft is so much more influential in Australia and New Zealand than anywhere else in the world. I mean, people from other parts of the world can jump in and say, no, it's the most, but, Malcolm is by far the most influential person in our corner, much more influential than you and I, Arie, probably put together. That's not so much so in the United States, even though he's at that very prestigious part of Harvard, the Kennedy School. I've had conversations with Malcolm himself about this, so it's not just my interpretation; it's his own. What's your thought on it?
Okay, thank you, John. Arie will collect questions and remarks. I have one until somebody else will jump in. Which of the chapters you are most proud of? Out of the two, which is your favorite baby? Keep it.
Look,
you don't have to answer now. Let's take more.
I'll tell you now while you're waiting for the answer. That diagram, developed over the years, and I sit there with people in classes, and I can spend hours on that one, just going through saying, look, this is what's at your disposal. You need to understand what a rich variety of mechanisms to help you achieve what you want to achieve, provided you have an understanding of what you want to achieve. And that's all difficult. So go back to, the chapter that says, here's a methodology that you can just go through logically. And one of them is, what options do you have? Let's do the criminal law. Let's create a new law. Let's increase maximum penalties. And it's all useless stuff. Have a look at the richness of what public policy regulatory options are.
Excellent. More questions, remarks?
No, they're all dead or quiet out there.
I was looking at my computer looking for an improved graph of your tools of government. I asked my assistant to do it, and I will look for it now and show it to the audience in case they are interested. But any more? Simon, please.
He's my friend Simon.
This isn't Dorothy Dix. It's called regulation in Australia, but when I go through the chapters and look at the references, it's not clear that it's particularly specific to Australia. Like some parts are, obviously the structure, federations or whatever, but I was just wondering if it didn't have in Australia, what would be different?
Look, what I tried to do there, you're quite right. Look, I make the point in the introduction that it's, regulation is universal, but it's also specific. And so as much as possible, I've used examples from Australian legislation, Australian studies, Australian authors, so that it makes sense to people in Australia, but it's grounded in the universal issues and topics. We can talk about responsive regulation or risk-based regulation, but then I say, and here's how it's operating in Australia. So people can pick up the universal themes and say, well, in Ireland or in Israel or in the US, this is how it apply. But I think the contribution there is not to pretend that I know enough. And what's interesting is, as David said before, we have made a contribution, the authors in Australia, Fiona Hayne, Peter Grabowski, Gunningham, and all of those. They've written about Australian problems, but the problems are not confined to Australia and the answers are not there. But as many examples go to Australian law so that it makes sense. It's not a huge audience, but it's the one I know, I suppose. That's what I've done. But I do hope it makes sense everywhere else.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me show you, Arie, and all the rest of you, what I did from your graph. I don't know if you see it. You probably see it. So this is the iconic graph of Arie.
Yep.
And I loved it so much that I asked my assistant to make it more user-friendly for teaching. So here you have the main categories, and afterwards she went and did the rest. So if you want the slides, they are available for you. Just send me an email and I will send them.
Slice it.
I didn't know that you said this is the tools of government that I like so much. And indeed, if you think about it, the two books are outcomes from the tools of government. So it all makes sense now.
I'm aware that stuff is not cutting edge, but not everything is cutting edge. I think, getting back to basics for people who don't know what they have.
Just stop apologizing. It's an excellent contribution. Thank you so much for doing it. It's important for teaching, and I appreciate what you did. One last question before we close, and I will allow you also to say a few final words. Which is the other book that you like on regulation and governance you would recommend? And don't say John's responsive regulation because everybody knows it. So what else?
Um,
Is it Malcolm's? The craft of
no,
regulation?
look, I'm not a fan of Malcolm's stuff. I've taught into his programs, and I can't see the magic of them. But as John said, it's very, very influential here. Although I think they're running out of customers. The only other thing I'd say, if you look at the bibliography, apart from and I'm not sucking up too much if I possibly can't. But I think one of the major contributors, it's not a book, but it's the body of work emerging from Carey Cognanesi, who I found was coming up with something almost every day, making you to look like you've got writer's block. But there's a lot of interesting stuff there. So I don't think he's put out the major books, but the accumulation, the body of work I found extraordinarily stimulating and useful. And I think he tops the charts in the number of citations, which is saying something with you two here. And I think on that sucky note, we should finish. And I thank you for the invitation. It was lovely to see and meet everyone. And I'm happy if anyone wants to email me or ask any questions if they're too shy. My email is easily findable on the web. Lovely to see you all. Honored to have you all here.
The same is here. Thank you so much, Ali. Thank you so much, all of you. See you in the next webinar, and keep safe, John, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
I gather they speak English in Liberia. Is that?
A
Yes,
lot
they
of
do.
people here congratulated me on my English. So they're, very, very kind people.